Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Parkour. In this video, I want to talk about OAuth, specifically OAuth 2. That's usually what we actually mean when we say OAuth. And there are lots of nitty-gritty details with regard to OAuth 2. So this is 100% an overview. There are specific ways to use OAuth that are in the specification that I'm not going to talk about here. I will leave links in the description below that talk more in depth about everything you could possibly want to know about OAuth 2, including some of the flows, as they call them, that I'm not talking about. So I'm talking about, I think it's called the Authorization Flow, which is more often than not what we think of when we think of OAuth 2. And then I'll also talk briefly about the Implicit Flow, which is also pretty common for little JavaScript apps and stuff like that. So basically, OAuth 2 is a way where a service provider, your application, can use a third-party authentication provider or identity provider. This might be Facebook, this might be Google, Amazon, Stack Overflow has their own, but they get more into something called OpenID Connect, which we'll actually talk about in the next video. Some of those well-known identity providers, but you could also use OAuth 2 as a way to kind of standardize your own authentication workflow, just to make it easier so that you can develop your authentication system in isolation, or even use someone else's. Keycloak is a popular open source authentication system, really good open source authentication system, and have your service provider, your application, be its own system, not have to worry about authentication at all. So basically, the authorization flow looks something like this. User lands at your application and is unauthenticated. They say, I want to log in, and click some button, or maybe your application automatically redirects them to the authentication provider. At the authentication provider, usually it will make sure that the referrer is accurate, so it's actually coming from a URL that is supposed to be able to use them for authentication services. Basically a quick, simple, not really authoritative way to validate that someone actually came from your application. But with that in hand, it will present a login page. User will enter their username and password in the login page. Again, this is on the identity provider or authentication provider's web application. So your application never sees a username or password. On the authentication provider's application, user enters username and password, and that gets processed. If it's successful, they will get redirected back to your application. If that's unsuccessful, many things might happen. They might just get an error message there and prompted to authenticate again, or they might get redirected back to your application with an indication to that authentication failed. One way or another, we're not going to talk about that side of the flow. If they authenticate successfully, they will get redirected back to your application with a code. This is not an authentication token. This is an interim code that usually has a very short lifespan. I don't even think it's 5 minutes. I think it's typically more like 30 seconds. But it's a long string. It follows the same rules as an authentication token, but that code by itself has only one thing that it can do, and that is to be upgraded into an authentication token. This is something that's okay to be exposed on what they call the front channel. So browsers. Your browser is considered to be an unsafe, unknown, unsecure area, whereas the back channel is secure because it's server to server. Those those connections can be encrypted, are not going to be susceptible to man in the middle, can be validated as this request will always come from this IP address, that sort of thing. Obviously not the case for your client device. Okay, so back to the code. The code comes from the authentication provider to your browser on the front channel, and that's part of the redirect to another page on the service provider, your application, the application that you're developing. So it might be something like myapplication.com/login code equals long string of letters and numbers. Once that page loads, or once that page is requested, it is the application you are building, it is your responsibility to send that code back on the back channel, not in the browser. This is a curl request if you're using PHP. This is an HTTP client, system.net.http client request in C#, something along those lines. Server to server communication. It is a request to take that code and turn it into an access token. And the flow is typically referred to as token, access token, something along those lines. Basically, it says, here is a code, here's my application ID, because all of this usually requires some application ID. Here's my application ID. Here's the code that I got back on the front channel. Please validate it and give me an authentication token back. That gives the identity provider an opportunity to kind of validate that the server is actually who the server says it is and has permissions to act on behalf of the user that authenticated. If all of that is in a good spot, it will send back an actual authentication token, and that is what is used to identify the user in further requests. So to get additional information, or to potentially use as a user token to send to other services that use that same authentication infrastructure. Now, the thing that's a little bit weird about OAuth 2 is it only standardizes that flow. So the front channel communication and then the back channel communication. That's the only thing that's standardized by OAuth 2. So what that response looks like from the authentication token request, that's kind of up to the service provider and the identity provider to negotiate. Typically, identity providers say, here's how I provide this information, usually a JSON document with an authentication token property and maybe some other information, things like user ID, email address, that sort of thing. There are additional layers on top of OAuth 2. In the next video, we'll talk specifically about OpenID Connect. That is a layer on top of OAuth 2, an additional standard that uses a JWT, a JSON Web Token. So I mentioned that in addition to the authorization flow in OAuth 2, I'd also talk about the implicit flow. The implicit flow is generally thought of as a little bit less secure because it happens 100% on the front channel. This is good for web applications that don't have a backend, that are just a the JavaScript snippet on a page, or even just a 100% JavaScript client-side application. Basically what happens here is user opts to log in somehow, clicks a button, something like that. Browser, still on the client side, redirects to the identity provider. Identity provider logs them in and sends a request back to responds with a redirect request to the page that the user came from, with the access token right in the URL. Typically, these access tokens are enforced by the IDP to have limited rights. So there are only certain things you can do with those access tokens because they were acquired 100% in secured space on the front channel. So I think these are used for like the Facebook share button, things like that, but they don't have permissions to like go deleting a bunch of stuff or mass updating information or anything like that. All of that stuff is reserved for access tokens that are only acquired on the back channel. There are other flows. There are other OAuth 2 flows. I won't get into them here. You can look them up in some of the links down below. But hopefully this gave you a good overview of the main flows that are used by OAuth 2. I almost exclusively use the authorization flow because typically I am writing an application that has a backend server to it. But you might find yourself in a situation where you need to use one or the other flows. If you do, I'm more than happy to hear about it in the comments. If you have any other thoughts or questions about how OAuth 2 works, go ahead and leave that down below as well. Again, I will leave links to a bunch of resources down in the description below. If you like this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. I've got more videos like this coming up in the coming week or two, I believe. So stay tuned for those, and definitely leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I will see you tomorrow.